Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Matthew Garrett. I'm a professor here at Bakersfield College, and it's my pleasure to welcome everyone to another event organized by the Bakersfield College Institute for Liberty. We are a coalition of faculty who are dedicated to fostering critical thinking at the college through a variety of avenues that center on small group meetings with students, as well as large forums like this. We try to bring attention and depth to increasingly marginalized attributes of Western civilization that we believe are necessary for the good life and good communities. The Renegade Institute works to emphasize and explore such concepts as individual liberty and responsibility, democracy and republicanism, meritocracy, and more. And this evening, we are delighted to present a very special guest. Dr. David Schein is an author, professor of business, private attorney and consultant for employment and social issues. He holds the Cameron Endowed Chair of Management and Marketing at the University of St. Thomas in Houston, where he also serves as the Cameron School of Business Director of Graduate Programs. He's the author of The Decline of America, which explores leadership triumphs and failures in the Oval Office over the past century. After only a few years in print, the second edition is nearly ready to roll off, and Dr. Schein is also wrapping up his next manuscript, a satire exploring the shortcomings of the notable congressmen and congresswomen. This evening, Dr. Schein will share with us his thoughts on the ethics and leadership missteps in American presidential history, and then we'll explore a little bit more in question and answer session afterwards. We invite viewers to type out their questions in the Q&A box as they come to mind. And then after Dr. Schein's remarks, we'll go through those questions and see what he has to say about your thoughts. Without further ado, Dr. David Schein.
Thank you so much, Professor Garrett. And I'm delighted to be able to speak with you and your audience tonight. And as we talked about in our bit of a pre-show, is that I was looking forward to being there in person, and I am delighted to be there even via Zoom, and hope perhaps next spring to come out and be there and talk about the new book. But I wanted to talk tonight a little bit about some big picture issues from my first book, Decline of America. And, you know, bottom line is I wrote a bipartisan book, though it's a very interesting dilemma that I encountered, because I've spoken in a number of places all over the United States. I've actually spoken about the book in San Miguel de Allende in Mexico, a popular American retreat near Mexico City. And one of the things I discovered is that libertarians, Republicans, independents like my book. People on the left are offended by the book because I've been told point blank that if you rank Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, and Barack Obama with the same grade, a D-, that they cannot stand that you cannot do that. You have to rank Bill Clinton and Obama above George W. Bush. And so it's very interesting, and people tend to overlook the fact that the highest rated president in my book is Harry Truman, who last I checked was definitely a Democrat, in fact, a pro-union Democrat. And so people sometimes miss the point. But part of the focus was the selection of Wilson was on purpose, because Wilson's administration and America's entry in essentially the victory of World War I was exclusively the United States by the time they intervened, that it's what I call the beginning of the American empire. And people who are history buffs can talk about the situation with the Roman Empire, the British Empire, the Byzantine Empire, and we're at about right at the 100-year point, because the American empire really sort of started at the end of the Wilson administration, as we clearly, won World War I, and with the failed attempt to establish the League of Nations. And so that's part of the principle. And I think the big question today in the decline of America is an optimistic book. It is not a pessimistic book. And I mentioned this in particular, again, talking about how the book was received. We got some great reviews on Amazon, but we had some very interesting things happen. So I ran around and talked to a bunch of homeschooling organizations, and they said, Dr. Schein, we love your book, and we're so glad you gave us a copy, the people running the organizations, but we don't want to make it a text for our kids because the title's pessimistic. And I said, well, you got to read the book and understand what it talks about, because the idea is that somehow we've run out the 100 years of the American Empire, and we're going to need to do things better to get another 100 years of the American Empire, which I certainly hope will happen. And so I thought that was kind of interesting in terms of the feedback you get about something just based on the title of the book. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the key elements that we talk about. The structure of the book is there's an introductory chapter, and then there is a chapter for each president from Wilson through Obama. As you indicated in your kind introduction, we do have a Trump chapter outlined, and I have actually begun a fair amount of development work on a Biden chapter, and we will be working on a new edition or a new production of the book, perhaps with a different or more optimistic title when we get to do that. But I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the benchmarks that we hit over the last 100 years. The first one is that America was late to both world wars. World War I, we put up with an awful lot. Wilson negotiated with the Germans and did a lot of stuff before they finally actually entered the war and did an amazing job. In World War II, Roosevelt actually negotiated with Hitler and Mussolini, these true terrorists, as we would call them today, and said basically, you can have Czechoslovakia, you can have Poland, just leave us guys alone. And until Pearl Harbor, the United States basically was bunkered in and failed to do what they really should have done at least 2 years earlier. And my example, of course, we're in football season, is that in both World War I and World War II, the United States entered these games in the fourth quarter and giving the other teams, or the opponents in this case, Germany, Japan, and so forth, an awfully big lead where millions and millions of people died and suffered horribly because the United States didn't act when it really should have acted. In addition, some of the things that people don't realize is the amount of racism that was practiced from the top. If people do more research on Wilson, Wilson was regarded as a progressive, and of course that term is bandied about today. And he's, of course, has a major bridge in Washington, D.C., one of the biggest bridges in the United States, the Wilson Bridge, connecting Northern Virginia and the Baltimore, Maryland area. Is people like to overlook the fact that Wilson was an overt racist. There's no other way of describing it. If you read the words of Wilson, he was definitely a racist. And through Roosevelt, another person that certain parties like to trump up as a good time guy and a great president, and Roosevelt ran World War II with a segregated military. Harry Truman is the president who desegregated the American military. Despite the Emancipation Proclamation, the United States military was segregated until after World War II. So we have to face some of the facts of things that happened. My personal opinion is the egos of some of these people prevailed over the best interests of America. And anecdotally, I think that's something that we're encountering today. And so presidential bungling has cost billions and billions of dollars, and today it's up in the trillions of dollars. And we've particularly had a rough ride, I think, since World War II, since Harry Truman, and I'll talk some more about that in a minute. But part of the dilemma for the American voter is that we can either have good candidates who make poor leadership decisions. An example of this that I use is Jimmy Carter, who is still with us and as big a whack job as he could possibly be today. But he was a genuinely decent human being as the president of the United States. I think he held to high moral ideas, and he was an awful president. And it's a very sad thing. Of course, he realized that he was an awful president and was suffering from hemorrhoids, largely driven by his nerves as he dealt with crisis after crisis. And when people talk about the runaway inflation that we're beginning to see in the United States today, since the beginning of 2021, a lot is made of the runaway inflation during the Jimmy Carter administration. And in contrast, we have people like Bill Clinton, definitely not a good guy, clearly not a moral person. I think more is going to come out about Clinton as despite Jeffrey Epstein's mysterious death in a secure jail cell, is that the reports that I hear on Clinton that we can't document fully indicate that he was part of the partiers that would go and do some unusual and inappropriate things. But of course, we all know about the shenanigans while he was in the White House. But in addition, Donald Trump clearly made a lot of good decisions for America, but I don't think anybody's going to confuse Donald Trump with a really nice guy like a Jimmy Carter. But the question is, how are we going to get there from here? Who are we going to vote for? Are we going to vote for a wacky guy, but maybe makes good decisions for the country, or what people perceive as a nice guy or even a very ethical guy? I wish those were not the choices. I wish that we were choosing from people with high moral character, great leadership skills, and so forth. But honestly, we seem to be in a run of electing people to presidency who are clearly compromised candidates and not a clear path forward. And I think some of the things that we also need to look at is in the international arena. As I mentioned earlier, that America was late to both world wars, not a good situation, but some of the things that we also mention in the book from chapter to chapter is that the United States actually had a protective agreement with China before World War II. And Japan was repeatedly making incursions into China. There were significant events, military fights, skirmishes, if you will, between the United States military and the Japanese in China prior to World War II. The United States failed to defend China, instead deciding to stay out of it. And of course, the net of that is that we lost China as an ally, and we lost Pearl Harbor, because by letting the Chinese suffer under the hands of the persecution of the Japanese, the country was dominated by China. And of course, following World War II, China was a very weakened country, and the terrorist Mao Zedong took over the country. And of course, right now, Xi for the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, is claiming that Taiwan is really under his jurisdiction when he's got it backwards. He's a terrorist. He took over the mainland due to the damage and the weakness following World War II. But Taiwan, in my opinion, and I think the opinion of the world, is the legitimate government of the country of China. So I think it's going to be kind of interesting to see what happens. But the United States, again, summary, failed prior to World War II to defend China and help China, and then got what could be expected afterwards when Mao Zedong swept through China and drove the legitimate government of China under Chiang Kai-shek out to the island of Taiwan, a very successful democracy, both in terms of its government and its finances. And I wouldn't look for that to continue under a CCP dominated government. And I think we only need to look at the takeover of Hong Kong over the last 20 years, and particularly over the last few years, to see what it looks like if we let China take over independent countries. And I think that's a very sad situation. We need to pick better friends. One of the things that we seem to have done in the United States in terms of international relations since World War II is we seem to pick some real bad folks. Batista was the interim government in Cuba who we supported prior to Castro's takeover. Part of the reason Castro was able to take over Cuba is because Batista was not a good guy. He may have been aligned with the United States, but that didn't mean that he was a good guy. And I really think if the United States had taken a different approach in Cuba, we would never have had Castro. And of course, we could have probably dealt with that a lot better, especially since it's in our backyard, as the cliche goes. It's just a mere, I think it's 90 miles off the coast of Florida, and should clearly be either an ally of the United States or part of the United States, in my opinion. Further, in Vietnam, of course, a war that we lost is a situation where we backed a couple of folks over there. There was a Key and a Van Lock, who were governors, if you will, of South Vietnam, who were, again, corrupt individuals, failures both from in terms of inspiring the country to work together with the United States military to avoid a political and military takeover by North Vietnam. And we all know how that ended in 1975. And, I think the conclusion is that the United States needs to do a better job of what we did in World War II. We need to act decisively, and we need to be a benevolent winner. We helped put Europe back together under the Marshall Plan. We did a phenomenal job of helping Japan recover while prosecuting the leaders of Japan, although we did not prosecute the emperor. We did prosecute the military leaders for Japan following their unconditional surrender. In contrast, we fought to a tie with the North Korea, which was backed by a very young China at that time. And that would have been the time for the United States to put its foot down, to crush North Korea, and told China to mind its own business or they'd get the same. And of course, we did not do that. And that provided a lot of the leverage that was then used to have North Korea invade South Korea, and but also set a model for North Vietnam to invade South Vietnam. And so we have some parallels there that are very sad parallels. And the United States has only really won a war since World War II in Desert Storm under General Schwarzkopf, under the presidency of George H.W. Bush. And probably the biggest mistake they made there was to have not taken Saddam Hussein out of office at that time. They had to go back in and, of course, deal with him later following 9/11. But there's a need for the United States to acknowledge some of these past mistakes. And of course, the latest mistake in this series of virtually unforgivable military and political losses, of course, is the still active debacle in Afghanistan. And some of the worst news I've heard recently is that they are talking about giving Afghanistan, the terrorists, the Taliban, some humanitarian aid. And I'm sorry, the only humanitarian aid we need over there is to get as many people out as want to leave, and then tell them that we won't blow the rest of the place up as long as they don't send terrorists outside their territorial limits. I don't think negotiating with terrorists makes any sense. And I also don't think that the average person in the country of Afghanistan will get any benefit from anything. I think the terrorists will take it and fatten their pockets and feed their terrorist operation. I don't see them getting out into the very rough countryside. One of the reasons Afghanistan is such a difficult country for us to deal with militarily is because of the distribution of the country, with a very mountainous and rough terrain, very limited highways, things like that, surrounded by other not particularly favorable countries like Iran and Pakistan. So there's a reason that this was a tough go, but I think the United States could certainly have handled the situation dramatically better. But again, it is unfortunately becoming a running situation, again, starting with the Korean War in the early 1950s. And I'm very concerned that this string of ridiculous losses to third and fourth rate powers will give the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, the incentive to invade Taiwan. And I think we've got to finally draw a real distinction and to say that in association with the United Kingdom, with Australia, and other significant world powers, that there will be no military takeover of Taiwan, and that Taiwan will continue to be independent as long as the United States itself exists. And I don't think that that is something that is inviting war, but I think if China understands that is what's going to happen, that I don't think they will continue to pursue Taiwan. But I think it's time, or well past time, for us to put our foot down and make sure that they understand what's going on. I wanted to go through just a list real quick and then invite our questioning about, well, this is kind of what we've seen over the last 100 years. How do we extend the American empire? And I have a list of proposals here, and I'm just going to run through them quickly, and then maybe we can talk about them. I understand we won't be doing live interaction, but that you'll be reading questions from your audience. But I think failure to control the national debt, the federal deficit, is fatal to America. That America cannot continue to spend money that it does not have. It must balance its budget. It must spend its money reasonably. We must control America's borders. And I want to be clear about this, because sometimes people paint conservatives as anti-immigration people. Here's what I'd like to do. I'm a professor. I want the feds to give me 10 green cards every single semester. Summer, fall, spring. I want 30 green cards a year. And I want to be able to pick out graduate students and top undergraduates and say, hey, would you like to stay here when you finish? I'm vouching for you. Let's stay here. Let's be part of a great American diversity, the great American melting pot, and hang out. So I'm in favor of smart immigration. I'm not in favor of bringing everybody who can cross the border into the country, because we do not need more people who need to be on the public dole. We need people productive. But I'm okay with bringing in people who are truck drivers, who are machinists, who are carpenters. I'm not being an elitist about this, but we still need to do responsible job, and we must secure our border. I think we need to reform our electoral system. I'm in favor of term limits across the board from the president on down. And we need to commit to capitalism. The capitalist system works. And I think one of the things, again, referring to China as our major threat in the world today, is people misunderstand current day China between the CCP, the Communist Chinese Party, and the Chinese economy. The reality is the only reason that the Chinese are able to feed themselves, the only reason that the Chinese have become any type of economic power is because they gave up on communism as an economic system. They have essentially a capitalist system, largely driven by whatever they could steal from the rest of the world in terms of intellectual property. They have a one-party system. That is the Communist Party. And sometimes I think people confuse the fact that they have a capitalist economy with a communist single-party government. And I think that's kind of an interesting development. And with that, Dr. Garrett, I'm pretty close to a half hour, and I wanted to go ahead and let's talk with some of our audience tonight.
All right, thank you so much. We do have some questions that I'll go through, and I have some of my own that I want to add to the mix as well. But thank you for your comments. It's great. One thing I want to ask you is that you spent a little bit of time discussing that we sometimes struggle to find a president who's both ethically, morally good and also a good executive. And I wonder, is there something about our system that creates that dilemma, or is it possible to get such a person, or what reforms would be necessary to get a president that's both morally good and good at their job?
Well, as you know, one of my hot buttons beyond the national debt is term limits. And while term limits sounds like a simplistic reply to a difficult problem, I think that we do need term limits, and that having more turnover in the presidency and our public offices would definitely contribute to having a better look at people. Also, I think this is going to sound very strange to you, but I was a political candidate 30 years ago. It was a very rough experience. It was an interesting experience. And I can tell you that at the time I was a political candidate, there was a well-defined path to heading up the ladder. You would run for school board, or my joke is you'd run for dog catcher, which of course is not an elected position. And you'd work your way up to precinct chair, and you'd run for state rep. And if you did good, you'd run for state senate. And then when you were middle-aged, maybe if you were successful, you'd run for US Congress or the US Senate. And we've lost track of that. I mean, Donald Trump had never held elective office and was elected to the president of the United States. In contrast, Joe Biden has never accomplished anything in his life other than getting elected. And if you look at his entire elected history, there's nothing you can pick out and say, gosh, this guy did a great job. For this bill is the Joe Biden hallmark. But it's for someone to be around Washington for over 40 years and have not a single big credit to his name indicates that our current system is broken in both directions. I think people should need to have some type of a track record before they run for higher office. And also that, again, we've got to recycle people so that we follow the earlier tradition. And by the way, we didn't need term limits until around 1900. Prior to 1900, and really pretty much since World War II, is when we've had these people bunker in Washington and trade back and forth with the military-industrial complex. And I'm a big fan of strong military. I'm not a big fan of the military controlling our politics.
All right. Along the same lines, there's a question I can see in the queue that fits right into that same sort of questioning. Victoria asks, why do you think we struggle so much? Hold on here, it's being silly. Why do you think we struggle so much with only selecting Republican and Democrats versus other parties? Do you think we could find those who are ethically and morally good in other parties?
Yes, absolutely. And in fact, that's a wonderful question because it fits so well with me, because I really think that we are on the way to a multi-party system. And I think presently we really have four political parties disguised as two. We have the Socialist Party, which is in the Democrat camp right now. We have traditional Democrats, which is a shrinking number, but still a significant percentage and represents actually most of Democratic voters. Then you have the centrist Republicans, sometimes called the rhinos, Republican in name only, Mitt Romney being a good example of that, and Liz Cheney up in Wyoming. And then on the other end, you have the conservative Republicans. And maybe the Trump Republicans are somewhere in between the centrist and the conservative Republicans. A lot of conservative Republicans reject Trump as representative. The question is not whether that's possible. The question is can we make the administrative changes that would make that possible? Most of the major democracies in the world are not two-party systems. They're multi-party systems, and then governments operate by coalition. We're really doing that, but we're not doing it de facto. But unfortunately, I think we're going to have term limits before we can start letting in other parties. I think, for instance, that if I was African American today, and as you know, Herschel Walker in the month of September has already raised $3.7 million to run against Warnock in Georgia. But I think that there's a really distinct situation where you might have a Hispanic political party, an African American political party, an LGBT political party, and we might see some very interesting things in the future instead of jamming everybody into the two camps that we have today.
Okay. Another question from Adam. Adam asks, does the modern media have any hand in the ongoing decline of our leadership?
Yes, and in my book, I actually have a separate chapter. Again, the middle of the book is a chapter on each president, and I grade them. And then at the end of the book, I have a chapter on economics, a chapter on media, and a chapter on, summarizing the book. And I can tell you that the media has had a love-hate relationship with the political parties over a long period of time. Something that people may be surprised to hear is that during Roosevelt's first 8 years or so, from 1932 when he got elected, of course he took office in 1933, until about 1939, 1940, he castigated the media for being against him. And, the media was largely politically conservative at that time. And so it was a very interesting. I don't know if Hearst was a factor. I think he was, but I don't want to commit to that because I'm not remembering that directly. But the thing is that the media has really transitioned over into being a political machine. And I look at CNN and MSNBC and ABC, NBC, and I look at Newsmax and I look at Fox, and we've got a really spaced out media operation. And I think that the media has become its own worst enemy. And to give you an idea, that the New York Times just published a massive retraction of a recent article. And the New York Times was considered that and the Washington Post were for many, many years considered the gold standard for journalism. And both of them are now considered political rags. And that's not necessarily good for America. And I'm not saying that in a positive sense, but I'm saying that with a touch of sadness that we don't have reliable journalism like we may have had prior to, say, I think the decline really started in the 70s and 80s, but obviously got very pronounced since that time.
You also had made a reference to Cuba, and you said something about how Cuba might even belong, maybe it should be part of us or something. And I think that caught the attention of one of our professors, who asks, how can the US territories be utilized to build the US over the next 100 years? And I'd like to add to that, what are your thoughts about Cuba or other adjacent territories? Is that something that you're eyeing as a possibility for growth and expansion?
Well, it's a very interesting question, and let me answer it with a piece that I wrote but has not been published. About 2 years ago, right after my book came out, the current book, I wrote a piece on Puerto Rico that says Puerto Rico is part of the United States. It's a legitimate territory. And I've been there, I've spent some time there, I've explored the island. It's not a particularly large thing. You can drive around it in a day or two. And we have treated Puerto Rico very badly. And I think it sets a model for what's happened in Cuba. And so one of my proposals, which is going to sound like a Green New Deal, if you'll pardon the reference, is that we go into Puerto Rico and make Puerto Rico the success that it could be, and make it a model for other operations like that. For instance, in the hurricane that obliterated Puerto Rico, and I'm drawing a blank on which hurricane, but this hurricane obliterated Puerto Rico about 3 years ago, and they lost 3,000 people at a minimum because power was out. People who were diabetics could not keep their insulin refrigerated and died due to lack of insulin. In the United States, for a United States citizen to die for lack of refrigeration is unthinkable. And what we needed to do, and I think we still should go in and do it, is to go in and put a first-class wiring system in the country with below ground power, because it is an island, it is subject to hurricanes and other forces, and to modernize the island to make it a strong operation. And then to say to people in Cuba and Belize, which is below Mexico on the Yucatan Peninsula, countries like that, say whether you become part of the United States or not, there is a model for doing this right. And so I don't think we can make a good case to Cuba right now, given the pathetic case that we're doing to Puerto Rico. But I think that would be a good first step. But I think the Cuban people have had just about enough of the Castros and the repression. And I think that if the people are ready, that the government of the United States should be very supportive of an effort to convert it back to a democracy. But if we do, we can't have another Bay of Pigs debacle. We've got to go in there, as I just suggested with regard to Puerto Rico, and we've got to do it the right way and stop pussyfooting around and spending billions of dollars and getting nothing done.
Great. I want to get back to the international. You spent a little time on there, and one of our questions that's been sitting in the queue a little bit from a student asks, he says, you seem a bit oriented towards interventionist policies, and yet we seem to find history showing that these policies just cause us continuing problems. Should we reserve our military to 100 miles of our coastline for only for World War scenarios? And I'd like to add to that question that when I speak to my libertarian-minded friends, a lot of them think that the ethical argument is to be more isolationist. So how does a book and an argument for ethical behavior include an interventionist policy beyond our borders?
Very good. A wonderful question. And again, a close reading of my book, the later chapters, I specifically say that the only time we should use the American military is to commit to a total victory, like we scored in World War II. That to go in and waste billions and billions of American dollars, and more importantly, the lives of our military families and supporters of our military families, is unthinkable and inexcusable. And I'm not just working backwards from the 13 members, 12 men and 1 woman who were murdered on the outskirts of the Kabul airport. That's inexcusable. For us to do that to these fine young Americans who are willing to fight for America and fight for America's freedom, we've got to use them more carefully. And what I argue in my book is that we do not go to war. We do not commit our military resources unless we are in there to absolutely take over whatever objective. In a specific instances, South Korea, which was a democracy, asked for the United States to keep it from being taken over by the communists in North Korea, who were being supported by the terrorists in mainland China, the CCP. The United States should have done what they did in World War II. There should be a united Korea, and that would have stood as a message to the remainder of the area, being China, that's how the United States does business. So when we go in and we do things stupidly and we compromise at exactly the wrong time, and I have to be careful about Cuba because I want to point out something very quickly. Douglas MacArthur was in charge in Korea. He knew what was happening. And he said to Truman what I just said, that the only way to do this, and the United States had the capability to wipe out the North Korean army and to establish a sole Korea under domestic and democratic rule. Instead, Truman said, oh, well, we got this UN thing going, and maybe we'll look like aggressors, and maybe that won't look too good. So Truman, when MacArthur went public, pulled MacArthur. Now, here's the dilemma. Truman was right politically. In the United States, the president is the chief of the military. It reports to him, and you can't have a general who disobeys or disrespects the president. But at the same time, Douglas MacArthur was right. And it's been proven in Vietnam. It's been proven in the Middle East. And the point is very simple. I don't want American resources and human beings to go into any situation unless our commitment is complete and utter takeover. We have the ability to do it. One of the best examples of this is in Vietnam. There was, and I'm drawing a quick blank on the major battle that was around 1968 in Vietnam. But what happened at that time was the United States won that battle. How do we know? Because the North Vietnamese general wrote a book around 1990 and said, you know what? We lost that battle. And the American media, speaking of the American media, presented it as if the Americans had lost that battle. But what happened is the public perception that we lost that battle rolled into the loss of Vietnam, and there were many, many good people. How do I know that? The city of Houston, where I am tonight, has a gigantic Vietnamese population. Where did they come from? They were refugees from Vietnam. Some of the best people on earth came here, great immigrants, great start, but they deserve to have stayed in their own country, except the United States fouled it up.
Yeah. Yeah. So in answering that, you sort of mentioned a little bit about not just presidential policy, but also some generals that were involved in shaping that policy. And I think that segues well into another question from another student, Mark. He writes, the choice of a good person but bad leader versus a bad person who is a good leader might be a little simplistic. Can you factor in, or should we factor in, the cabinets, the advisors, all who influence and determine policy? He says, wouldn't a bad person simply override the recommendations and install more sycophants or to continue their bad policy? how much blame do
Well,
we put on these advisors, and how much weight do they carry?
well, I think this is a very good point, and actually, given that we've already partially, we haven't got it ready to go to print yet, but we've already pretty much got the Trump chapter put together. One of the pieces where we're going to ding Trump, just telling you up front, is his poor choice of staff. Trump had an extraordinary turnover in staff, and in fact, we intend to include in the Trump chapter a chart showing the cabinet members and how many of the cabinet members turned over. And I mean, we only need to look at the Attorney General appointment of Trump. Sessions was an awful, awful Attorney General. And no matter whether you're Republican or Democrat, you have to admit that Sessions was a disaster. Why was he appointed? He was the first member of the American Senate to endorse Trump for president. That was his claim to fame and the only reason that Trump appointed him. Trump also kept a liar and a fraudster in James Comey as head of the FBI. Basically, Comey destroyed the reputation of the FBI with the Steele dossier and a lot of other nonsense that happened during the Trump administration, because Trump had the opportunity to replace him. So when you're electing a president or you're electing a senior official like a governor in a state, who they surround themselves with is absolutely relevant. And we have just gone through the exact opposite political position, but the same group of losers and criminals. You've got a person in charge of transportation who's coming from a tiny city. Do I care whether he's gay or not? Absolutely not. I care whether he knows what the heck he's doing. We've got a person in charge of Homeland Security who doesn't understand the security of the United States. And we've got an attorney general who's compromised on something that he's supposed to be doing. His son, the wife of his son, is running a CRT peddling operation. And Merrick Garland is supposed to be cracking down on those terrible terrorist parents who want to see their school systems run better. So no, I think staffing is very important. And probably a good example of that goes all the way back, unfortunately, beyond my book to Lincoln. And there's a wonderful book on Lincoln and I'm drawing a blank on the exact title, but it's a collection of enemies. It's a beautiful book, but it talks about the fact that the people that Lincoln had behind him were a heck of a good group. One of them was Seward, the Secretary of the Interior, who bought Alaska from a struggling Russia in what is probably the second best deal that the United States ever made. The first one, of course, being the purchase from Napoleon of the Louisiana Territory. The Louisiana Purchase has to be the best buy since it was the whole center of the United States. But yeah, great staff is important. But again, because of our media and because of our politicized system, I don't know that we've really got a good bead on who's going to do well. I'm going to talk about myself for a minute. I was a candidate to be an assistant secretary of labor back under the George W. Bush administration. I never got to any formal level. I was just on the list among hundreds of others. But I can tell you that I would not have wanted to join the more recent administrations, Obama and Trump and Biden, because their governments are so badly run that people with integrity and skill are more liable to become consultants, highly paid consultants, and sit on the sidelines or work with states rather than work for the presidency. And that's not a good situation.
So you're kind of painting a picture where we have some maybe unethical people that are used as a vessel, a vehicle to achieve sometimes good policies. But you seem to have some concerns about using those unethical people, especially in foreign policy.
Yes.
I was reading in your book, there was a passage I wanted to come back to about some of these I don't remember, there were some big uglies that you're referring to that get used. And I wonder, is it possible to use these blunt, awkward, totalitarian dictator people to achieve our ends, or is that really just not acceptable and we should not be involved in business with those kind of people?
Well, I think you might be thinking about when we talked about Vietnam and we talked about, we supported Key and then Van Locke, and we defeat our objective when we support people who do not support basic American ideals. And it's a very unfortunate situation. And I think this goes back to a question we had just a few minutes ago, is I'd be in favor of just staying the heck out of a country and not committing American men and resources if we do not have a reasonable government, or we do not have the government to take out the existing government and put in a responsible government. And now remember that there are federal rules today that govern the CIA, because the CIA allegedly in the 50s and 60s was running around South and Central America, taking out leaders who the administration felt were inappropriate to democracy, hence the term banana republics. And so we actually have a law that says we're not supposed to do that. But unfortunately, I think in some cases, and Afghanistan may be a good example, is we work with people who are so weak that they folded the day the Americans left. But I think for Afghanistan specifically, that the very best thing we could have done in there is to run a guerrilla raid in there and to kill off the Al-Qaeda people who were camped out there, and then get out of the country. Russia certainly put which is much closer to the operation than the United States is. Russia put in a major push, lost many members of the military, spent billions of their dollars, and did not accomplish anything. The United States has just proved that Afghanistan is really a place where the United States and the rest of the world may be best off just putting a fence around it and staying the heck out of there. And I think that goes back to one of the questions we had.
Yeah, you're speaking about military occupation. I wonder about less overt influence, propping up dictators and whatnot, like we've, the history of Central America or Philippines or whatever. Is that an appropriate role for the United States, to prop up people and support people who maybe aren't sharing our values?
I think it is
good for business.
I think it's a slippery slope. And I think the military industrial complex that is benched all around the Washington Beltway. And again, I spent some time in DC, which was one of the spurs for this book. And the MIC, military industrial complex, likes to see us do that, because we usually give them military aid that they make. They manufacture the guns and weapons that we then spend billions of dollars giving to these countries, with the understanding that they're going to support the United States and not go communist. But I think it gives the wrong message to the American people and to the people in these countries. And I think we need to be cleaner than that. And I favor, again, staying out of a country if we do not have a reasonable level of support, or doing something that Congress says we shouldn't do, which is to take out their leadership and to put in people who should be running the show for the benefit of the people. We have such incredible corruption in governments around the world that it's tough to pick those winners that we want to help out.
Yeah. Well, we're running out of time, so I just want to ask one last question from one of our students. Kind of to wrap things up, I thought Tanya's question could bring us back together on everything. She asked, if America continues on the path it's going now and doesn't adopt your suggestions for reform, what do you think would happen in the near future? What are the consequences?
Well, I don't think being the largest economy in the world in itself is an essential element. But so in other words, whether mainland China's economy is benchmarked as larger than the United States economy, I don't think that's a legitimate benchmark. Just as we don't say a company that has the highest number of sales is the best company, we usually say the company that has the highest amount of profit. So what I favor is that we run things intelligently, and we're not doing that today. Some of the suggestions that I have that relate to this are, we need to make a dramatic reform in federal and state government employment. Specifically, and again, this statistics are in my book, less than 10% of the American private sector have pension plans. Most of us have savings plans, but not pensions. On the other hand, in the public sector, over 67% of the public sector have true pensions in addition to savings plans, and are radically overstaffed and poorly managed. So I favor a dramatic reform of civil service. I favor cutting federal government employment by 1/3. And I favor telling the rest of them that we're going to pay the pensions that we promised you, but if you start work for the federal government today, you will get a savings plan participation, but you will not get a pension. And we will stop funding the pensions for anyone who continues to work, although they will, again, in fairness, get the pensions that they've already earned. The only exception I might make is the US military. But other than the US military, and I'm open to discussion about that, I think we've got to make a radical reform in the public sector. And if we don't, at some point, people are going to figure out that this is a giant Ponzi scheme along the lines of Bernie Madoff, and that we're going to be in the same shape that Greece has been, Italy has been, that South American dictatorships have been, and that's not a good situation. So I am very concerned about the United States, and that's why I focus on the national debt.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure speaking with you this evening.
Same here, and I really look forward to coming out to your campus and meeting everyone.
Yeah, we'll have to have you out maybe when COVID pandemic passes. Thank you for your time tonight, and it's been great having you. And thank you to all of our guests that came and watched today. Have a good evening.
And thank you to everyone who joined us tonight.
Thank you.